April 9th, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The pain in Robert E. Lee's chest feels like a rifled musket ball lodged beneath his ribs, but no Minié ball has touched him. He is not reviewing his troops. He is not planning another audacious flanking maneuver that will save the Army of Northern Virginia from certain destruction. He is buttoning his best gray uniform, the one with the golden sash and the ceremonial sword he has not worn since the 7 days battles 3 years ago. The air smells of apple blossoms and wet earth, spring arriving as his cause dies. The thunder of artillery has stopped for the first time in 9 months of siege warfare, replaced by a silence more terrible than any barrage, the quiet of inevitability. His hands, usually steady when sketching defensive positions or adjusting his field glasses, tremble as they work the brass buttons. Through the window of the McLean house, he can see blue-coated cavalry, Sheridan's riders, forming a cordon around the village. His army, once 75,000 strong, now numbers fewer than 28,000 starving men in rags, many without shoes, most without hope. In 6 hours, he will surrender to Ulysses S. Grant, and the war will effectively end, but Lee's mind is not on this moment. It travels backward, not to yesterday's final retreat from Petersburg, not to last July's repulse at Cemetery Ridge, but to a sweltering afternoon 2 years and 9 months earlier, when a single decision by one of his most trusted generals set in motion the cascade of disasters that brought him to this parlor, this surrender, this end. Lee knows what the Richmond newspapers will say, what Jefferson Davis will claim in his exile, what the Lost Cause mythmakers will write for the next century. They will blame the North's overwhelming resources, the strangling blockade, the shortage of rifled muskets and artillery, the lack of European recognition. They will speak of inevitable defeat against impossible odds, of honor preserved in noble failure. That is the lie. Lee knows the truth. The Confederacy did not lose because it was weak. It lost because of Gettysburg, and Gettysburg was lost because James Longstreet refused to attack when ordered, delayed for hours on the second day when speed was everything, and argued against every offensive thrust Lee proposed. In Lee's mind, the name burns like phosphorus. Longstreet, his old warhorse, the general he trusted most, the corps commander whose cautious obstinacy transformed certain victory into catastrophic defeat and drained the Confederacy of irreplaceable men it could never afford to lose. To understand why Lee would spend his final years after the war quietly, persistently blaming Longstreet for the South's defeat, we must travel back to June 1863, when the Army of Northern Virginia was at the peak of its power and confidence. Lee's 75,000 veterans had just won a spectacular victory at Chancellorsville in May, where Stonewall Jackson's flanking attack crushed Joseph Hooker's larger Union force and sent 17,000 Federal soldiers reeling back across the Rappahannock River in disarray. The cost was terrible. Jackson himself fell to friendly fire, his left arm amputated, dying 8 days later from pneumonia while murmuring in delirium about crossing rivers. But the tactical lesson seemed clear. Audacious offensive maneuvers, rapid concentration of force, and aggressive attacks could overcome Union numerical superiority. Lee's strategy for 1863 required taking the war north, invading Pennsylvania to threaten Washington, relieve pressure on Virginia's exhausted farms, encourage Northern peace Democrats before the 1864 elections, and perhaps force Lincoln into negotiations that would recognize Confederate independence. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and the fighting quality of his veteran infantry, men who had marched through Maryland's dust and Virginia's mud, who had stood against massed artillery at Malvern Hill and charged through the cornfield at Antietam, whose rebel yell could break Union lines that outnumbered them 2-1. By late June, Lee's 3 infantry corps were strung across southern Pennsylvania from Chambersburg to York, cavalry screens ranging as far as Harrisburg, living off the rich farms of the Cumberland Valley, seizing horses, cattle, and grain that Confederate Virginia could no longer provide. In Washington, Lincoln was in near panic, pressuring his latest commander, George Meade, who had replaced Hooker just 3 days earlier, to find Lee's army and destroy it before it could threaten the capital. The collision came almost by accident on July 1st, when Confederate infantry brigades approaching Gettysburg from the northwest encountered Union cavalry under John Buford holding the ridges west of town. Within hours, the engagement escalated as both sides rushed reinforcements forward, transforming a meeting engagement into the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. By late afternoon of that first day, 2 Confederate corps had driven Union defenders through Gettysburg streets onto the high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, strong defensive positions but not yet fortified, held by disorganized Union troops who had suffered 9,000 casualties in 6 hours of savage fighting. Lee arrived on the field at 4 in the afternoon, surveying the tactical situation from Seminary Ridge, his trained engineer's eye immediately recognizing what every officer present could see. The Union Army was vulnerable, shaken, its flanks exposed, its artillery still coming up. One more push before darkness, a coordinated assault by fresh troops against Cemetery Hill, and the entire federal position might collapse, opening the road to Washington and forcing Lincoln to sue for peace. This was the moment. Lee turned to his senior corps commander, James Longstreet, the burly Georgian whose defensive tactics at Fredericksburg 7 months earlier had shredded 12,000 attacking Union soldiers against a stone wall, and issued a direct order: attack Cemetery Hill immediately with whatever forces were available before the Federals could consolidate their position. Longstreet refused, not with open insubordination, but with the tactical foot-dragging of a subordinate who believes his commander is making a fatal mistake and will slow-walk compliance until the opportunity passes. He argued the Union position was too strong, that his corps was scattered along the roads, that attacking uphill against artillery was suicide, that Lee should disengage and maneuver south, find defensive ground, and force Meade to attack, instead of exhausting Confederate manpower in frontal assaults against fortified positions. Every word Longstreet spoke was tactically sound. Defensive warfare in the rifled musket era favored the defender enormously, as Fredericksburg had proven, but strategically catastrophic, because Lee's entire invasion depended on winning a decisive victory before Union reinforcements arrived. Lee's normally composed demeanor cracked. Officers nearby saw his face flush, heard the steel in his voice as he repeated the order: attack now, before darkness, before Meade's entire army concentrates on that ridge. Longstreet saluted, turned his horse, and rode slowly back to his corps, where he spent the next 3 hours repositioning artillery and realigning divisions, while the sun sank toward the South Mountain ridgeline and the opportunity evaporated like morning mist burned away by July sun. By the time Confederate troops were ready to advance, darkness had fallen. Union engineers were digging entrenchments on Cemetery Hill, and 20,000 additional Federal soldiers had arrived via the Baltimore Pike, transforming a vulnerable salient into a fortress anchored on both flanks by steep, defensible terrain. Lee's chief of artillery, Porter Alexander, would write years later that July 1st at 4:30 p.m. represented the Confederacy's single best chance to win the war, and Longstreet's delay destroyed it. The pattern would repeat the next day, July 2nd, when Lee ordered Longstreet to attack the Union left flank early in the morning, and Longstreet spent 7 hours arguing, repositioning, and delaying until his assault finally went forward at 4 in the afternoon instead of sunrise. Those 7 hours allowed Union commanders to rush the 5th Corps into position on Little Round Top, the rocky hill anchoring Meade's left, turning what might have been an open flank into a defended strongpoint where Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine would make its legendary bayonet charge and hold the position by a margin measured in minutes and ammunition. Longstreet's brigades fought magnificently that afternoon through the Wheatfield and Devil's Den and up the boulder-strewn slopes of Little Round Top, suffering 40% casualties in some regiments. But the delays had made victory impossible, and by nightfall, Lee's army had gained only a few hundred yards of blood-soaked Pennsylvania farmland at the cost of 9,000 irreplaceable soldiers. July 3rd, 1863. Cemetery Ridge, 1 in the afternoon. The temperature approaches 95 degrees, the humidity oppressive, no wind to clear the sulfur smoke that hangs over the battlefield like yellow fog. For 2 hours, 150 Confederate cannon have bombarded the Union Center, the largest artillery concentration ever assembled in North America, trying to soften the Federal position before the infantry assault Lee has ordered against the Union Center. The noise is beyond description, a continuous rolling thunder that can be heard in Pittsburgh, that makes the earth shake and horses scream in terror. that sends solid shot bowling through Federal batteries and bursting shells showering iron fragments across Cemetery Ridge. Union artillery replies with counter-battery fire, 80 guns firing as fast as crews can swab and load, turning the valley between the ridges into a fog of smoke pierced by the orange flashes of muzzles and the red trails of shells with burning fuses. At 1:30 p.m., the Confederate guns begin to fall silent, their ammunition exhausted, caissons empty, horses dead in their traces. In the woods along Seminary Ridge, 12th 500 infantry under George Pickett and Johnston Pettigrew form up in parade ground lines of battle, 3 ranks deep, battle flags uncased, officers checking percussion caps and adjusting formations. These are veteran soldiers, men who fought at Gaines's Mill and 2nd Manassas and Chancellorsville, but they know what awaits them. The distance across open farmland to Cemetery Ridge is 1,400 yards, nearly a mile of grass and wheat stubble with no cover, sloping gently upward toward a stone wall lined with Federal infantry and artillery loaded with double canister, those devastating anti-personnel rounds that turn cannon into giant shotguns capable of cutting down entire companies at 200 yards. Every veteran in the Confederate ranks understands the arithmetic of rifled musket fire. A trained soldier can fire 3 rounds per minute at effective range of 400 yards, and the Union line contains approximately 10,000 riflemen behind stone walls plus 40 cannon. The mathematics are murder. Longstreet knows it, has argued against this assault all morning, called it suicidal, begged Lee to reconsider. Lee has overruled him, believing his veterans can achieve what seems impossible, that Southern elan and courage can overcome Northern defensive positions, that one more supreme effort will break Meade's army and open the road to Washington. At 10 minutes to 2, Lee gives the order. Longstreet, his face gray with resignation, cannot speak the command. He simply nods to Pickett, who salutes and turns to his division. Up, men, and to your posts. Don't forget today that you are from Old Virginia. The drums beat the advance. 12,500 men step from the tree line into summer sunlight, battle flags snapping, lines dressed, officers mounted, bands playing, the most magnificent and terrible sight of the Civil War. For the first 200 yards, they walk in perfect order, ignoring the Federal artillery that opens fire immediately, solid shot plowing furrows through the ranks, shells bursting overhead. But the Confederate lines close up and continue forward, an unstoppable gray tide flowing across the open ground. At 600 yards, Union batteries switch to shell, explosive rounds that burst at ground level, sending iron fragments scything through densely packed formations. Men fall in clusters, gaps appear in the line. Still they advance, flags forward, though the formation begins to compress as soldiers instinctively move away from the artillery fire raking their flanks. At 400 yards, Federal infantry opens fire, 10,000 rifled muskets delivering 3 rounds per minute, the sound like continuous thunder, powder smoke obscuring everything, Minié balls hissing through air thick with lead. The Confederate charge begins to disintegrate. Regiments lose cohesion. Soldiers run forward in small groups, seeking any cover in the open field, slight depressions, farm fences, bodies of fallen comrades. At 200 yards, Union artillery fires double canister, essentially giant shotgun blasts of iron balls that tear through packed infantry like a scythe through wheat, killing and maiming dozens with each discharge. The Confederate assault splinters into desperate fragments, a few hundred men reaching the stone wall at a place that will be called the high water mark of the Confederacy, actually breaking through the Union line in a brief, savage hand-to-hand fight with bayonets and clubbed muskets before Federal reinforcements drive them back. In less than 50 minutes, the assault is over. Of the 12,500 men who stepped from Seminary Ridge, fewer than half return. The rest lie dead or wounded in the July heat, the field covered with bodies so thickly that witnesses say you could walk from one ridge to the other, stepping only on corpses. Every brigade commander in the assault is killed or wounded. Pickett's division effectively ceases to exist as a combat unit. As the shattered remnants stagger back toward Confederate lines, Lee rides out to meet them, repeating over and over, "It is all my fault. It is all my fault." But in his heart, Lee believes the fault lies with the delays, the missed opportunities, the assault that came on the third day instead of the first when it might have succeeded, and the general who argued against offensive action at every turn. The Army of Northern Virginia begins its retreat from Gettysburg on the night of July 4th, a wagon train of wounded 17 miles long, crossing the Potomac back into Virginia, having suffered 28,000 casualties, one-third of its strength, losses it can never replace. The Confederacy has perhaps 750,000 military-age white men remaining. The Union has 3 million. Lee's army has lost not just soldiers, but the cream of its officer corps, the veteran NCOs who held companies together, the experienced artillerists who could adjust fire on the fly, the cavalry troopers who could screen movements and gather intelligence. These men cannot be replaced. Southern military academies and training camps cannot produce experienced veterans, and the Confederate conscription system is collapsing as more men hide in the mountains or desert to Union lines than report for duty. Worse, Gettysburg coincides almost to the hour with Vicksburg's surrender on July 4th, where John Pemberton's 30,000-man garrison capitulates to Grant after a 47-day siege, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in half, cutting off Texas beef and Louisiana salt and Arkansas grain from the armies in Virginia and Tennessee. The twin disasters of Gettysburg and Vicksburg mark the turning point of the war, the moment when Confederate defeat becomes not just possible, but probable, when the question changes from, can the Union win, to when will the Confederacy collapse? Yet in Richmond, the recriminations begin immediately, and Lee, who publicly accepts all blame, privately begins constructing a different narrative. In letters to Jefferson Davis and in conversations with staff officers, Lee hints that the battle might have been won if his orders had been executed with more alacrity, if certain subordinates had shown more aggressive spirit, if the assault on July 2nd had gone forward at dawn as planned instead of late afternoon. He never names Longstreet directly. Lee is too much the Virginia gentleman for open criticism, but the implication is clear, and others with less discretion make the charge explicit. Confederate officers who survived Gettysburg begin dividing into camps, those who blame Lee for ordering impossible frontal assaults, and those who blame Longstreet for delaying and sabotaging those assaults. The lost cause mythology that will dominate Southern historiography for the next century begins taking shape almost before the guns cool, a narrative that requires Lee to be perfect, incapable of strategic error, which means someone else must bear responsibility for Gettysburg's failure. Longstreet, the slow, methodical Georgian who advocated defensive warfare and questioned Lee's offensive tactics, becomes the scapegoat, accused of insubordination, delay, and lack of fighting spirit. Charges that ignore his brilliant defensive stand at Fredericksburg and his successful flank attack at Chickamauga 3 months after Gettysburg, but fit the narrative Confederate veterans need. The South did not lose because its cause was wrong or its strategy flawed, but because individual generals failed at crucial moments. The historical reality is far more complex and damning. Lee's strategy in 1863 was fundamentally flawed, based on the assumption that one more spectacular victory on Northern soil could break Union morale and force Lincoln to negotiate, ignoring the mathematical reality that the Confederacy could not sustain the casualty rates required for offensive warfare against an enemy with 3 times its manpower and 10 times its industrial capacity. Gettysburg was not lost because Longstreet delayed his attacks, but because Lee chose to fight an offensive battle against a numerically superior enemy occupying strong defensive terrain, exactly the kind of engagement that favored the defender in the rifled musket era. Every military analysis since 1863 has concluded that Lee's tactics at Gettysburg were suicidal, that Pickett's charge in particular represented a catastrophic waste of irreplaceable veteran soldiers in an assault that had virtually no chance of success, that Longstreet's caution and advocacy for defensive maneuver was tactically sound. Yet Lee could never accept this verdict, because accepting it meant acknowledging that his entire strategic approach, the preference for audacious offensive maneuvers that had won at Chancellorsville and 2nd Manassas, was obsolete in the face of rifled muskets that could kill at 400 yards and field artillery that could fire 3 rounds per minute. After the war, when Lee became president of Washington College and devoted his remaining 5 years to rebuilding Southern education, he consistently refused to write a memoir or detailed account of his campaigns, but in private conversations with former officers and in letters to friendly historians, he repeatedly returned to Gettysburg and the conviction that the battle was winnable, that victory slipped away due to subordinate failures. Longstreet, meanwhile, committed the unforgivable sin of criticizing Lee's tactics in post-war writings, of arguing that the Confederacy should have adopted defensive strategy throughout, of joining the Republican Party and accepting appointment as a federal official during Reconstruction, all of which made him a traitor in the eyes of Lost Cause adherents. The resulting controversy poisoned Confederate veteran reunions for decades, with elderly men screaming at each other about what happened on a July afternoon in 1863, about who gave which orders and when, about whether attacking or defending represented the proper course. Arguments that were really about the larger question they could not face: whether the war itself had been just, whether slavery was worth 750,000 dead Americans, whether the cause was ever truly noble or merely rebellion in defense of human bondage. Grant's Overland campaign in the spring of 1864 proved which strategic approach was correct. When Grant assumed command of all Union armies in March 1864, he adopted a strategy of relentless offensive pressure, accepting high casualties but continuously replacing losses and grinding down Lee's army through attrition. In the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, Union armies suffered horrific losses. 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes at Cold Harbor, some of the worst slaughter of the war, but Grant did not retreat. Unlike McClellan, unlike Burnside, unlike Hooker, Grant absorbed his losses, brought up reinforcements, and kept advancing, forcing Lee to fight defensive battles that consumed his dwindling manpower without achieving decisive victories. Lee's army shrank from 64,000 in May to 35,000 by June, losses he could not replace, while Grant's army was continually reinforced with fresh troops from the North's bottomless manpower reserves. By mid-June, Grant had maneuvered Lee into the siege lines at Petersburg, precisely the static warfare Lee had spent 3 years avoiding, because everyone understood that in a siege, the side with more men and more supplies would inevitably win. For 9 months, Lee's army slowly starved in the Petersburg trenches, soldiers deserting at rates of 100 per day, rations cut to 1/4 pound of meat and 1 pint of cornmeal per man per day, horses dying from lack of forage, artillery immobilized for lack of ammunition, while Grant's well-fed, well-supplied troops extended their lines westward in a slow strangulation that made Confederate defeat mathematically certain. Longstreet, commanding a corps in these Petersburg trenches, must have reflected bitterly on Gettysburg, on the moment when he advocated for defensive warfare and maneuver and was overruled, on the 28,000 casualties lost in Pennsylvania who might have extended the Confederate defense by months if they had been preserved. If Lee had fought defensively in 1863, if he had entrenched along the Rapidan River and forced Meade to attack, if he had conserved his veteran soldiers for the defensive campaign of 1864, could the Confederacy have prolonged the war until Northern war weariness led to Lincoln's defeat in the 1864 election and a negotiated peace? It is one of the great counterfactuals of American history, impossible to answer with certainty, but the question haunted Confederate veterans for the rest of their lives. April 9th, 1865, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Lee sits across from Grant in Wilmer McLean's parlor, the surrender terms written in Grant's neat handwriting on a small wooden table between them. The terms are generous. Officers may keep their sidearms. Soldiers who own horses may take them for spring planting. No one will be tried for treason, but they are still surrender, still the death of everything Lee has fought for these 4 years. Grant is shorter than Lee expected, rumpled, his uniform spattered with mud, a perpetual cigar clamped between his teeth, looking more like a farmer than the general who has destroyed the Confederacy's armies in Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia. They make small talk about the old army, about service in Mexico 20 years earlier, both men uncomfortable with the historic magnitude of this moment, until Lee gently brings the conversation back to business and signs the surrender document. It is done. The Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's magnificent, battle-hardened veterans who marched from the Potomac to the James, who fought at Antietam and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor and 100 other fields, who endured starvation and cold and defeat and still followed their commander with absolute loyalty, ceases to exist as a fighting force. Within weeks, all remaining Confederate armies will surrender. The war is over. The Union is preserved. 4 million enslaved people are free. As Lee rides back to his lines on Traveler, his gray horse, soldiers crowd around him weeping, reaching up to touch his boots, some crying out that they will keep fighting if he orders it, and Lee tells them gently to go home, plant their crops, rebuild their lives, obey the federal government. But already his mind is working on the problem of how this defeat will be remembered, how to preserve honor from catastrophe, how to craft a narrative that explains how the South's noble soldiers could have lost to Northern shopkeepers and immigrants. The lost cause mythology is already forming in his mind. The war was about states' rights, not slavery. Southern soldiers were outnumbered and outsupplied, but never outfought. The Confederacy fell only because of overwhelming material disadvantage, not moral or strategic failure. And somewhere in that mythology must be an explanation for Gettysburg, for the battle that killed the Confederacy's last hope, and Lee has already decided where the blame belongs. In the years after Appomattox, as the Lost Cause narrative solidifies into Southern gospel, the controversy over Gettysburg intensifies. Jubal Early, Lee's former Corps commander, leads the attack on Longstreet, writing articles and giving speeches accusing him of deliberate sabotage, of refusing orders, of losing the battle through delay and insubordination. Other Confederate generals pile on, their post-war writings constructing a version of Gettysburg in which Lee's plans were perfect, but execution was flawed, in which a single subordinate's failure turned certain victory into tragic defeat. Longstreet defends himself, pointing out that Lee's after-action report never criticized him, that accusations of delay ignore the tactical impossibility of the assaults Lee ordered, that Pickett's charge was doomed regardless of timing, but his defense makes him more enemies. Southern society in the 1870s and 1880s is engaged in a massive project of memory reconstruction, building monuments to the lost cause, celebrating the nobility of the Confederate soldier, refusing to acknowledge that the war was fundamentally about slavery and that the Confederate cause was morally indefensible. In this environment, Longstreet's apostasy, his criticism of Lee, his Republican politics, his acceptance of federal appointment, makes him an unperson, written out of Confederate history, blamed for Gettysburg, and by extension the entire war's outcome. Lee never publicly joins this attack, maintaining dignified silence on military controversies, but his private letters and reported conversations consistently hint that the Pennsylvania campaign might have succeeded with more aggressive subordinates, that opportunities were missed, that questions of timing and execution rather than strategy explain the defeat. It is a masterful evasion, allowing Lee to preserve his reputation while directing blame elsewhere, and it works. By the time Lee dies in 1870, 5 years after Appomattox, he is already a secular saint in the South, the marble man without flaws, while Longstreet has become the Judas who betrayed the cause. The historical injustice is profound, but it serves the psychological needs of a defeated people desperate to believe their sacrifice meant something, that they lost not because their cause was wrong, but because individuals failed at crucial moments, because fate intervened, because anything except the truth that the Confederacy was built on the evil of slavery and its defeat was morally necessary and militarily inevitable. Modern historians have largely vindicated Longstreet. Military analysis of Gettysburg consistently concludes that Lee's tactics were flawed, that offensive operations against strong defensive positions in the rifled musket era required overwhelming numerical superiority, that Pickett's charge represented the kind of tactical mistake that West Point cadets study as an example of what not to do. The delays Longstreet imposed on July 1st and 2, rather than sabotaging Confederate chances, probably prevented even worse disasters by forcing assaults to wait until proper reconnaissance and artillery preparation were complete. The larger strategic question, Whether the Confederacy should have fought defensively throughout the war remains debatable, but most scholars agree that Longstreet's caution and preference for defensive warfare was tactically sound given the technology and manpower disparities. Lee's reputation has undergone substantial revision as well, with historians acknowledging his tactical brilliance while criticizing his strategic vision, particularly his preference for costly offensives that the Confederacy could not sustain, and his failure to understand that the war would be won through logistics and attrition rather than spectacular battles. The Lost Cause mythology has been thoroughly debunked, exposed as a deliberate propaganda campaign to obscure the central role of slavery in causing the war and to rehabilitate the Confederate cause for political purposes during Reconstruction and Jim Crow. Yet the controversy over Gettysburg persists, still argued by Civil War enthusiasts and professional historians, still capable of generating passionate disagreement 160 years later, because the questions it raises cut to the heart of military command. When subordinates believe their commander is making a fatal mistake, do they have an obligation to delay or resist? When should loyalty override tactical judgment? How do we assign responsibility for battlefield defeat? To the commander who ordered impossible assaults, or the subordinates who executed them poorly, or the system that created strategic conditions making defeat likely regardless of tactical decisions? The sun sets over Appomattox on April 9, 1865, casting long shadows across the village where American history pivoted toward reunion. Lee's soldiers stack their muskets and fold their battle flags for the last time, many weeping, some cursing, all exhausted by 4 years of war and 9 months of slow starvation in Petersburg's trenches. Grant's army watches in respectful silence as their enemies surrender, ordered not to cheer, to treat these defeated men with dignity. Tomorrow, paroled Confederate soldiers will begin walking home, back to Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia, to farms burned by Union cavalry and cities occupied by Federal troops, to a South that must be rebuilt and reimagined without slavery, without secession, without the illusions that led to this catastrophe. But before they scatter to the four winds, before the Army of Northern Virginia dissolves into memory and myth, Lee gathers his staff officers one final time and tells them what they must remember: that they fought bravely for a just cause, that they were defeated only by overwhelming numbers, that their honor remains intact despite defeat. He does not mention slavery. He does not acknowledge that the cause itself was flawed. And when conversation turns inevitably to Gettysburg, to the battle that might have won the war if only certain things had gone differently, Lee allows others to voice the criticism he cannot speak himself, that Longstreet's delays cost them victory, that opportunities were missed, that individuals rather than systems failed. It is a comfortable lie, a necessary lie for men who have lost everything and need to believe the sacrifice meant something, but it is still a lie. The truth is that Robert E. Lee blamed James Longstreet for the South's downfall because the alternative was unbearable, that his own strategy was fatally flawed, that his preference for audacious offensive warfare destroyed the army he loved, that Gettysburg was lost not through subordinate failure but through his own miscalculation, and that the Confederacy fell not because of what one general did or failed to do on a Pennsylvania battlefield, but because any nation founded on slavery and dedicated to its perpetuation deserved to fall and could not ultimately survive against a free society with 3 times its population and 10 times its industrial power. Lee carried that knowledge to his grave, but could never voice it, and so Longstreet became the scapegoat, bearing the blame for a defeat that was inevitable from the moment South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter and set in motion a war the South could not win.